Hi, is it afternoon? Good afternoon, everyone.
Hello.
My name is Shraddha Guerra. I am a school psychologist currently working in Delaware County. I'm also the Southeast representative of the Association of School Psychologists of Pennsylvania. I'm happy to be here today. We're going to talk to you about practicing culturally responsive mental health supports at the intersection of sexual and racial identity. So this session will help school counselors in meeting the mental health needs of diverse student populations. We will address the social emotional needs of LGBTQ plus youth, the impact of racial trauma, and discuss culturally responsive mental health support in schools. So I'm going to start by talking to you about cultural responsiveness in schools. So I want you to think first about what it means to be a culturally responsive mental health provider. What does it mean to be an inclusive mental health provider and provide inclusive services? And feel free to just shout out some words or phrases that come to mind.
Not all at once. There's a lot of people. I don't want to talk over anyone. Like unbiased.
Unbiased. Mm-hmm. Being aware of bias, great. Anything else? All right, so keep that in mind. Think about it. Think about what it means to have our own cultural identity and then recognize and understand others' cultural identities and how we respond to those identities, how we interact with those identities, and what those identities mean in the context of social and emotional learning. So one tool that we can use to really understand different cultural influences and different cultural identities is Pamela Hayes' addressing model. So this is a model that really looks at individual cultural influences and really helps us think about and understand where we lie within each of these cultural influences and where our students are. So think about each of these areas. Think about your own identities. Think about where your power and your privileges lie in each of these identities and where you may be marginalized within each of these identities. So using this as a lens, we can really think about the opportunities and the challenges that our students face and use that to really help us understand how students may feel privileged, how they may feel empowered, and in what ways that they may feel marginalized. So in looking at this, I'll give you a second to take a look at each of these areas. Again, think about where you fall, where your identity falls within each of these areas. And think about, are there any areas that are not here? So I would be remiss if I did not bring up intersectionality when we talk about cultural identities. We just looked at the addressing model and we looked at all of those different areas where our own social identities may lie. We know that students, we know that individuals have multiple identities. And if we don't look at those multiple identities as a whole, look at how they intersect, how they interact, we know that we're not really truly appreciating the unique experiences of our students and how their different identities impact their experiences. All right, so let's talk about culturally responsive mental health services in schools. When we think about culturally responsive and inclusive mental health services, we want to think about it as a framework that really serves and supports all students, not just some. And we know that one way we can do that is through a culturally responsive multi-tiered system of supports model. Multi-tiered system of supports, or MTSS, is a preventative, proactive framework that uses data and a team-based approach to really meet the needs of all students. And with this framework, what we can do is we can meet unmet needs for students in general education and help prevent problems and difficulties as they arise or before they arise. So when we think about tier one and we think about issues that our students who are minoritized may face within a school, one way that we can really help these students feel more visible is by using microaffirmations. So microaffirmations are subtle acknowledgements of minoritized individuals' values and value and accomplishments. It's being able to point out, visibly confront inequitable, hostile, or biased behavior. So if you hear something, if you see something, speak up, speak out, confront it in the moment, and address it. And reflecting diverse representation of individuals in curricular materials. So are our students represented in our curriculum? Do they see themselves? Do they see the stories that they interact with, that they experience? Can they relate to those stories? And then believe students. So when we have students that come to us and tell us about their experiences of microaggressions, of racism, of sexism, of ableism, we need to believe them. It's important to validate our students' experiences. With that validation, they can feel heard, they can feel seen, and we can find a way to move forward and address the problems that are coming up. Another part of Tier 1, that universal aspect of MTSS, is transformative SEL. So transformative SEL is really about redistributing power within the social emotional curriculum within Tier 1. It's about making sure our students' voices are heard and that they're integrated, actively integrated as part of the school culture, school climate, and in the decision-making process. So are students represented on our school climate teams? Do our students have a voice in the school decision-making process for decisions that impact the entire school population? Again, do our curriculum materials reflect our students' identities? Are we integrating issues of race, class, gender, culture in our sort of typical bread and butter SEL topics? Are we integrating those experiences into those topics and making them relevant to our students' lives? So transformative SEL can really prioritize social emotional competencies. It can empower students to be change agents and empower students to take an active part of the school process and the school framework and the school culture. We also know that inclusive policies lead to inclusive climates. We know that an inclusive curriculum is important. We know that anti-bullying policies lead to a decrease in bullying behavior. We know that training staff on issues of LGBTQ plus youth SEL on other issues is important so that they're aware, they know what to look for, they know what to listen for, they know what to report, they know when to intervene. And we also know, unfortunately, it's not as prevalent as we'd like, but we also know that health services for LGBTQ plus youth is very important in order for them to feel dignified and have appropriate support. All right, so that moves us into tiers 2 and 3. So we're thinking more about groups of students and individual students now. When we think about groups of students and we're providing social emotional learning interventions for specific students, one thing we want to think about is making content adaptations to existing programs. I know this is easier said than done often, but it's important to look through the curriculum to embed additional information, embed a student perspective, embed those issues of race, class, et cetera, into the curriculum so that the content is more relevant to our students' lives. Having a supportive teacher, we know, is one of the strongest protective factors, specifically for LGBTQ plus youth, for their academic, behavioral, and social emotional success. Research has shown that students feel safer when teachers intervene in harassment. I'm sure that comes as no surprise to anyone. We also know that high school gay-straight alliances do influence campus climate and the health and academic success of youth. We know building that community, that opportunity to share experiences is important. And then lastly, we want to make sure we're expanding our own knowledge and awareness of students and families' worldviews. So bringing it back to the addressing model, bringing it back to those cultural influences that we talked about a few minutes ago, I encourage everyone to explore beyond your own cultural identities. Think about, again, your own power and privileges. Think about your own experience and think about your own lens. We all have our own biases and perspectives. And so I encourage you to think beyond that. Think beyond your own worldview and how you can gain experiences of other cultures, other worldviews. How can you push yourself beyond your own lens? All right, thank you.
So going to shift focus a little bit and focus on LGBTQ plus community and some mental health issues, concerns. What are some things that we as educators can do? What are some things that we have available for students to help support them? So just some basic definitions. I hope that one day presenting, we won't have to go over definitions anymore, but I still feel like at this point, it is good just to have a refresher for folks. So when we talk about sex, generally, we're talking about biology, talking about whether you were assigned male or female at birth. Then we look at gender identity. And that's really the internal sense that you have of being male, female, neither, both. Cisgender talks about people who identify with what they were assigned at birth. So I'm a cisgender female. I was assigned female at birth. That's how I identify. When we talk about transgender people, though, those are people who don't identify with what they were assigned at birth. So, for example, if someone introduces themselves as a transgender male, that's someone who is assigned female at birth, but identifies as a male. Non-binary is another common term, an umbrella term, and this is for people who don't fall strictly on, the black or white, male, female kind of binary of what gender is. And then finally, gender fluid is sort of a changing or fluid gender. So some days might present more masculine, some days might present more feminine, some days might present more androgynous, some days a mix of the two. And then finally, your gender expression is kind of your outwardly, your physical, your dress, your style, those things, the way you express your gender. So a good visual for this that I really like is the gender unicorn. I really think it kind of shows you where each of those things sort of live, so to speak. So if you look, the gender identity is kind of up in the brain area, kind of what you're feeling inside. The gender expression is on the outside. So that's kind of your outward appearance. Then you have the sex assigned at birth, physically attracted to, and then emotionally attracted to. Again, none of these things are mutually exclusive. It is a spectrum, and they can all go all the different ways. So a couple things just more specifically about transgender students. So gender at birth is assigned by a doctor by a visual inspection of the baby and what sort of genitalia they have. The problem with that, though, is there's roughly 200 medical conditions that fall into intersex so that the chromosomes or the biological piece don't match what the genital piece looks like. Klinefelter syndrome and Turner syndrome are two of the more common syndromes. We, at my high school, the student has since graduated, but only a few years ago, we did have a student with the diagnosis of Klinefelter syndrome. So both of those are pretty prevalent. Also, there are approximately 1 in 100 births have some degree of ambiguity in what the genital sex is. And then 1 in 2,000 births have so much ambiguity that genital sex is uncertain. So just to kind of go with and stick with your gender is whatever the doctor kind of said it is. There's some medical stuff behind that really doesn't always make sense. So some pretty staggering facts. LGBTQ plus teens are 6 times more likely to experience symptoms of depression than their heterosexual counterparts. And I think, as we all know and have seen since COVID, it made some kids' lives really a lot worse. In particular, 80% of LGBTQ youth felt that COVID made their living situation more stressful. Suicide is the second leading cause of death among all young people aged 10 to 24. But then if we look at our LGBTQ population, they are 4 times as likely to attempt suicide than their peers. The Trevor Project estimates more than 1.8 million LGBTQ seriously considered suicide each year in the US. Again, that's about 1 attempt in every 45 seconds. So, if you're thinking we're in here for this session for 45 minutes, think of what that equates to, that there's 1 attempt every 45 seconds. Very scary numbers. Something specific to Pennsylvania, GLSEN does a great survey every year that's a nationwide survey, but then they break it down state by state. So they actually have a fact chart for every state, which is pretty awesome. And you can kind of pull this information out. The vast majority of LGBTQ students in Pennsylvania regularly heard anti-LGBTQ remarks. Some also heard school staff make homophobic remarks and negative remarks about someone's gender expression. Most students in Pennsylvania experienced anti-LGBTQ victimization at school. Half never reported these incidents to school staff. That makes me so sad to hear that kids are feeling like they can't come and find someone to talk to say, hey, this happened, or hey, this wasn't okay. Some more things, 56% of transgender students were unable to use the school bathroom aligned with their gender. 48% of transgender students were prevented from using their chosen name or pronouns in school. 97% though of students could identify at least one school staff member who was supportive of LGBTQ students. So I think that's really positive. 59% had access to a GSA or a similar student club. Again, that number is great, but it would be wonderful if it was higher. And then this last one, I have recently had several students who have come to me about this. This seems to be like the current issue that our LGBTQ students are having. Only 18% were taught positive representations of people in history or events. So like Shada was just saying, it's so important for these kids to be able to see people like themselves to identify with. And then only fewer than 1 in 10 reported receiving LGBTQ inclusive sex education at school. So these kids are really struggling with all of this. And they're having a hard time. And statistically, they're more likely than their typical peers to be experiencing all these things. So what can we do as school staff? What can we do for these kids? Again, GSA, Gay Straight Alliance. I've also recently heard it changed to Gender Spectrum Alliance. So that's something that I think the kids were kind of pushing for. Another organization that is great is No Place for Hate. And this is a partnership with the ADL. They come and do some school programming. They have some trainings that they do with the students, and then the students do school-wide projects really focusing on the anti-bias, anti-discrimination. And I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. So No Place for Hate is great. Stand Together is another group that I think is pretty unique to Western Pennsylvania. I'm located in Pittsburgh, and it's through our Allegheny County DHS and Office of Behavioral Health. It sounds very similar to me to Avidum, which today was the first time that I had ever heard about Avidum. So I thought that was a pretty interesting connection. Very similar things. They come and do trainings with the students so that the students can then teach their peers about mental health and substance abuse issues. So to get that peer-to-peer sort of tutoring and education. And again, this group, they do school-wide projects to kind of try and reduce that stigma associated with the mental health issues. And then finally, gender support plans are just a great way to help transgender, non-binary, gender fluid students really work through their school day, help them be able to talk with their teachers about a new name that they're using or pronouns that they want to use, or talking about which, where do they want to change for gym class, which locker room do they want to use, different things like that. We use this in our district just to kind of help these kids have that difficult conversation with adults so they don't have to do it on their own or approach every adult individually to kind of talk through that. So as staff, adults, what can we do? I see you, I hear you, I support you. Sometimes that's all kids need to hear. They need to know that you're there and you're caring for them. So some different ways to do that. I know it gets into, there's some conversation about, should you ask kids what their pronouns are? Should you not ask kids what their pronouns are? Is that considered a survey? Do you need, permission to do a survey with students? But when you're doing your introductions, you can certainly offer your pronouns to students. When you say things like that to students, that's a sign to them. They're going to pick up on that immediately and think like, oh, that person, like they know, they get it. Like they're someone that I could go to at some point. Try to display images that affirm and support the LGBTQ community. Try to use gender affirming language. This one I've really been working. I say you guys all the time, and I really try to catch myself. It's just so easy to say like to a group of kids or people like, hey, you guys, come with me. But try to say, everyone or team or folks or, rock star students or superstars or just some other term that isn't specifically gender related. Try really, really hard to not separate kids into groups of boys and girls. We would never separate kids into groups of race, say all the white students over here, all the Black students over here. We would never do that. So we really should try to not do that with gender as well. You might unintentionally out a student who's not ready to be out, or you might cause some anxiety to a student who isn't sure if they should be on the boys' side or the girls' side. So causing them some anxiety that really doesn't need to be there. There's plenty of other ways that you can separate kids. Long sleeve versus short sleeves, kids who like Swedish Fish versus kids who like Sour Patch Kids, kids who like M&Ms versus kids who like Snickers. I mean, there's just so many other ways that you can do it without singling people out that way. And again, thinking about just allowing any and all students to use any single person non-gendered restrooms. We don't want to be gatekeepers for bathrooms. People have to go to the bathroom. It's what we do sometimes, and we shouldn't be gatekeepers for it. So just a couple more things about how to be an ally. Always use the pronouns and names that people ask you to use. Please, please, please don't ask, transgender people what their real name is. It's called a dead name for a reason. That's not the person that they are anymore. That's not the identity that they want to have anymore. They've kind of moved on. Politely, subtly correct others if they're using the wrong pronouns. Again, don't, be the police and come attack people for these things. But, sometimes if someone sends me an email and they're saying, she was late on her homework again, this is the third time, I'll respond and say, like, I can check in with him and see what was going on. It doesn't have to be that you're, calling someone else out. We're humans, we make mistakes, things happen. Words matter. We all know that words matter. So instead of saying someone was born a boy or a girl, try to change that language and say that people were assigned male or female at birth, because again, it really is something that's assigned. It's something that a doctor who looked down kind of decided. Similar to what was just said, confront your own bias and prejudices. We all have them. That's part of what makes us human. It's not that you need to understand all of these terms. It's not that all these terms need to make sense to you. But again, thinking about kind of the own biases that you hold, learning about that, being a little bit more open-minded, and just giving some acceptance to someone who is different. Anti-LGBTQ comments, jokes are harmful, perpetuate stigma. We always do training for our kids around bullying and bystanders and how to be an upstander instead of a bystander. And sometimes that's hard for adults to do. So to really think about if you're in company that kind of, makes jokes like this, it's not okay. And it is offensive to that group of people. And finally, do your own homework and research. Don't ask folks in the LGBT community to kind of educate you, kind of learn things on your own. If you want to be able to build that connection rapport with all the students, you have to have some sort of base of knowledge around it. The kids, as you know, are all pretty savvy, and they're not going to want to come and talk and open up to you if they feel like you're, closed-minded or you don't have any idea of what's going on. So really try to keep yourself up because things do change quickly, terms change quickly, words change quickly. So to kind of do your own research and just stay up to date with everything.
So I'm Amber Sessom. So I am also a school psychologist.
I guess I didn't introduce myself.
Oh, you
did I?
didn't? I'm really bad at that. I'm surprised I did.
So sorry. So I'm Shannon Dressler. I'm also a school psychologist, and I am the executive board secretary for ASP. And this is my 21st year practicing as a school psychologist in a public school.
I like executive what?
Executive board.
I like
secretary.
that. That sounds fancy.
Fancy.
I'm Amber Sessoms. I am the current president of the Association of School Psychologists of Pennsylvania. It's an honor that we were invited to be in partnership with you as we continue to understand that we don't work in silos, right? We have to do this work together and build community. Just really appreciative of my colleagues, how they're humanizing this data, but also in a sense of we have to do the self-interrogation and do our own work. That's ongoing work. So as I'm sitting here and processing and what's coming up for me, right? I have to acknowledge that and be able to understand that our students need to be centered at all times. So I'm going to just focus a little bit on looking at our Black and Brown students and just asking yourself, you think about this as I was listening to my colleagues, thinking about what's your default, right? What do we always go back to? What's our status? We always talk about norms. I'm not a big fan of norm, probably because it's a former employer of mine, and his name was Norm, but I don't like norms. I don't like those things. I don't like status quo. So agreements is what I like intentions, or what are our intentions, thinking about your intentions going into something. But what's your default? So thinking about how we are socialized in our culture in particular to look at things a certain way, and how do we unlearn a lot of these things and give ourselves grace along the way. And one of the things I often focus on is I love Sonia Renee Taylor. If you don't know her, Google her, get the book, do all the things. There's a workbook, there's all the things. She talks a lot about this idea of the default body. And what she talks about is oftentimes, I remember being in sessions, people would say, I don't see color when I see you. Clearly you do, because you just looked at me and you said, you don't see color. Hello, I'm here, right? So it's not about recognizing. So here's what she says, what I love that she says, and what really resonates with me is this idea that when I'm saying I don't see color, what you're really saying is I don't want to see the things about you society has told me are bad, are negative, or, all of those things that I had to grow up and live with and unlearn as a Black girl growing up in Middletown. Middletown's probably on a map now if you haven't seen. I see you made the face. She probably wanted to say, are you glowing? All of those things. Steve also lives in Middletown. If you haven't seen a documentary, 3 Mile Island, that's where we're from. I'm from there. He just kind of ended up there. This is true, as he just saunders away. But thinking about these parts of ourselves that should be ignored, hidden, or minimized, right? So what it does is these unspoken ideas that difference is the problem. But here's the thing, we talk a lot as school psychologists about where systems change. I think as we look at the system in place, and particularly if you come from a historically minoritized background, I often say that we have superpowers, that we can see systems very clearly. So it's our approach to dealing with difference that's the problem. Difference isn't bad, right? We're inherently beautiful human beings. And what that brings up for me is this dignity framework. So PDE has really adopted this Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity book. John Kronapple, Floyd Cobb have done this work and really looking at, you see people are changing the language if it's justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. I like to use JEDI because justice is really important to me in the work because it leads to action. They use equity, inclusion, and belonging. The state has really adopted that. This idea that belonging is unconditional, right? But in our society, we think that it's very much conditional. If I score A's on my test, if I do this well, how many reports can I get done? How many, all these things, it's a product, right? It's just how we commodify human beings, and that you, just as you are, simply breathing, simply existing is enough, right? So the idea of not enoughness is something that we really struggle with in our society. So they've really looked at this model. And on the left-hand side is this idea of, you can really start looking at how are we denying kids dignity? How are we doing it in very real ways? So the outside part, the denial, apathy, intolerance, and judgment are really the culture and climates we have in our institutions, right? Are these things existing within your institution? How do they show up? You know how you're going to know they show up? Asking and centering your students' voices. They will tell you when they're otherized, when they're dismissed, when they are marginalized, when they are mistreated. Those are your markers for if they are experiencing harm, right? And that their dignity is being violated. And some of the things that you have to see is individually, are you showing up in ways that presume incompetence? Paul Gorski talks about, deficit ideology, deficit mindset we have towards certain students or people that look like me in particular, right? We think about that. how do we are dominating conversations? How are we maintaining the status quo norms? How are we centering ourselves instead of centering our students? Blaming and shaming. It's a big one. I hear a lot of my colleagues that often come from Catholic upbringings. I grew up African. See, she's already shaking her. Right? The shame, right? That's like I'm dealing, I hear it all the time. Like I'm dealing with my Catholic guilt. I'm dealing like that shame that was put on me. I grew up African Methodist Episcopal. It doesn't seem very different because my mom still to this day is trying to shame and guilt me. I'm like, Mom, that stuff worked in the 80s. I'm grown now. You can't do that to me. But that's what we do, that shame and guilt. Do we do that? Do we continue to perpetuate that onto our students? And also degrading differences. Like, again, thinking that difference is bad, inherently flawed, is something that we have to unlearn. But what we want to do is lean into this dignity being honored. How do we be intentional about that? If you have a climate that's about listening, we struggle with that, wholeheartedly struggle with active listening, right? Shadra talked earlier about when they are telling you something, believe them. I always say the greatest gift we can give someone is holding space for them. The worst thing we do is don't believe them, we silence them. And we do it all the time. I've experienced that time and time again. We gaslight our students, we gaslight people from historically minoritized. They didn't mean that. Well, that's not what I meant. We make it about us, start to tears and the crying, and then they have to come and comfort you when they're the one that was caused the harm. We do it all the time. We've been socialized to think of that people that come from these backgrounds are strong enough, they're gritty enough, they can handle it. And we adopt that. I've personally adopted that mindset, that the strong Black woman stereotype, right? That I can just shoulder it and bear it right. And I said, you know what? I'm now my 41st year. I said, I'm living the back end different than that front end. And I said, I deserve ease. I deserve to have my needs nourished. I deserve rest. All of those things that I was told weren't afforded to me because of simply what I look like. These are the things that we have to unlearn. Thinking about are we open? Do we have an openness about us? Are we patient? What does the empathy look like in our building? And you can also know this too, not just talking to our students, but the staff. When I talk to staff members, when they're not experiencing these things, like it is pervasive, right? Like you are feeling devalued, degraded, demoralized. If you're feeling that way as adults with all these credentials and these degrees, and our kids that have come from these backgrounds that have already been looked at as negative and throwaways, how are they going to get that dignity when you're not even getting it? So how do you see that operating in your organizations? And how you'll know is they also have in this book, there's a belonging survey that you can adopt. And once you buy the book, you're free to use it. They talk about being appreciated, validated, accepted, and treated fairly. When I think about those things, the emotions that come up in me, right? When you think about my dignity and me being seen and feeling heard and being centered, that elation that I get from that, experiencing the opposite of that, what does that do to our spirits, right? We're talking about spirit murdering our kids daily. And the ways that we'll see this, we affirm differences and uniqueness, presume competence and positive intent, build partnership and community, repair harm and restore relationships, restoring relationships. And that doesn't always mean that you're bringing the person that was caused the harm with the person that caused the harm and saying, okay, work it out. That's not safe. So how do we do that in ways that there's an accountability, and accountability has to be built through relationship, right? How are we building relationships with our kids to hold them accountable and hold ourselves accountable as well? One of the things you can do, and you'll have access to this. I'm not sure who you need to talk to. If you get the Google Drives, if you want to email me, I can send it to you. But there's a PDF version of this on the Google Drive. And what I find helpful is looking at what are your needs. And like I say like needs being nourished. Every one of these categories, in particular play, we leave that one out as adults. But thinking about these needs, when you go through and you ask students, you ask adults, like, what do I need? What are the things that I identify that are lacking in my life? But I just need basic fundamentally to exist and be human. That's a chart that you can check out. And I'm looking at the time here. I don't see it. Okay, I got it. I want to say this. We don't bring this enough into education because of all badteacher.com, right? That's an actual website. But this is all about love, and love not in this romanticized version of it, but Bell Hooks talks about love, and she talks about the dimensions of love. And she talks about care, commitment, trust, responsibility, respect, and knowledge. Right. But it's also about a willingness to learn and cultivating awareness. So again, my colleagues talking about that piece has to be true to us. How do you make sure that you're embodying that, going through those dimensions? Am I showing up this way? One of the ways that I'll share with you really quickly is how I showed up for my students when they were experiencing really traumatic harm that was a viral racial incident that happened a few years ago was I centered them. I asked them what they needed, and they came up with this beautiful campaign of sorts that turned into this really fantastic model of how to center student voice. It was called Destroy the Hate. And what they did, we asked a question about, give me an experience you had recently that you experienced or benefited. Because there's some, like, I benefit or I suffer from a stereotype about you. Write it down. And then what they did was they destroyed it. There's data that shows when people are experiencing joy, that the temperature rises in the room, kind of like it's warm in here today. I don't know if you're experiencing joy, but it's hot. What they did when they ripped up, they literally wrote it down. And then I said, those things are not true. They do not find who you are. They ripped them up. And some of the things that students said was, the first one says, why are you a lesbian? You're so hot. This idea that you have to show up a certain way to be from a particular group, right? I was joking with my colleagues earlier, and they say, I often get assumed that I'm a part of the LGBT community because of how I usually show up. I'm a little fancy today because I have a holiday party, but people often will make assumptions about how I show up. These are the issues that we have, these binary ways of thinking. The one I had on my office door forever was, you're too smart for a Black girl. I was told that my whole life. The assumption that you make because of how someone looks, that they can't possibly be smart. And the idea is that you then assign, you're the exception to the rule. How do our students carry that, right? Or the idea that, why are you supporting them? You're white. Like, what if that has anything to do with your work, right? Like, those are the kind of things that this is all of our work to do. And when you start saying it's us versus them and creating villains and heroes, that's part of the issue. I will say, if you take a snapshot of this, Dina Simmons, Dr. Dina Simmons it's on her Instagram page. So if you're not on Instagram, I don't know if you can access it, but I think it's open. She has Liberate Ed, and she has SEL really racially and ethically focused and looking at all the ways that our identities intersect. And she gives you real life scenarios of like how you can do this work. So this was a recent one from the other day. All that we are is a story. And then she asked you questions like, in what ways are you a story? What is your story? How is your story still being written? And how have stories helped you connect to yourself and others? And she just holds space for students, right? You do these prompts and just the wisdom that comes from that. And you'll see if you get access to this, that there's some wisdom that comes from our students. I did holding space for our students and asking them to write about their experiences. We created monologues. And I'll just share this one quickly from our transgender student. Never forget, Charlie was my favorite. My first experience of really understanding and learning along the way with him. This idea that it's not that I blame the district, at least not anymore, but the anger that he had, right? Because we wanted to detonate him. We didn't know the terminology, we didn't have the tools. And how do you have to walk through and work through the humanity of that? And him having to reconcile the anger that he felt, because we don't allow people that come from historically minoritized perspectives and groups to have the full expansion of their emotions, because you're labeled that. I'm labeled the angry Black woman. Steve was just joking around. I did a panel for y'all at the beginning of the pandemic, and they labeled me in one of the articles as an angry Black school counselor. They didn't say Black, they said angry school counselor. So those things are very real. So thinking about how do you center student voice, how do you give them the chance to really reflect and write, and how do you believe them is how we start humanizing that. And you'll see in there, you can do a journey line. If you Google that, there's belief systems that are attached along the way. The peaks and valleys of your life. My beliefs were attached that I wasn't worthy of respect, that I wasn't worthy of being cared for and nourished. And how did that lead to my why, and why I do with the work that I do now is that I intentional about making sure that people are seen because I was so invisible and erased. And one of the ways you can tie this together is we had a awesome session with at our keynote was the VIA classification of character strengths. So as you're listening and centering someone, as you're telling their story, what characteristics and strengths do you attach to that, right? So it helps them disrupt this narrative about who they are as being broken and weak and damaged, right? Like they have tremendous strengths in spite of, but also how do we again look at the system, that the system is the piece that needs to be rectified and not the student, right? And I'll just leave you with this and thinking about when you do your own work, right? We're not contorting, tucking, like, changing who we are, trying to fit into this box, this narrative, that when we can be the full expansiveness of who we are, and when we can advocate and name the harm that's being caused, that gives light and courage to other people to do the same. And that's what we're trying to do, is spread light. There's so much division and hate going on that we are here to cultivate communities of love, right? That is our work to do. That is the charge that we have. And how are we going to be intentional about doing that? And really ways that's going to impact real people's lives. There's also some references that my colleague also shared. And here's our contact information. If you would like access to this and you're not able to get that, please do send us an email.
Any questions for any of us?
Yeah, I'm a 7th and 8th grade counselor in a pretty conservative school district. And I have a lot of middle schoolers who are interested in starting GSA or something similar. What's the best way to go about this and like presenting it? I've asked about it a couple of times, and I just kind of want to be able to like provide more information. Middle school, like all it is that can be kind of tricky.
So, I mean, there's so much research out there to support, so to, draw on the research so that they have the hard stats and data about it. Again, just the suicide rates are so much higher for the LGBTQ community, the rates of depression, anxiety, all so much higher. And then the research is out there to support that sense of belonging, that sense of inclusivity, a caring adult. Those simple things really help change that trajectory for these kids. So having a GSA, I mean, I'm assuming you have other clubs in your middle school.
Right.
So what's one more club? You know what I mean? And, be intentional about the person that you have as the advisor for that club, obviously, so that they can be supportive too.
What would you recommend is like the best, like, I feel like I knew all this when I was in grad school, and now I feel like I'm like removed from like knowing where the research is. Like, what would you suggest?
So the Trevor Project is great. They have so much information. GLSEN is another great resource. TSER, which is where I got the gender unicorn visual from. That's the trans student education resources. They also have a lot of great things on there. Yeah, so those three would be the big. So Trevor and GLSEN would be the big research ones. And then the TSER really has just more like images, infographics and things like that.
And then my next question is, with student nicknames, we have several nicknames in the middle school that are parent approved. And then we have some students that are requesting nicknames that are not parent approved. And, there are some teachers who are really not willing to call students nicknames. And we've kind of had some recent discussions kind of in my school and my district about, if you're going to use a nickname for one person, you need to use nicknames for everybody. Like if you're willing to. Yeah. Or if you're going to use first and last, or it's like you need to be consistent with whatever you're doing. I don't know, I'm just curious, like, kind of how to navigate this. As the counselor, I'm in support of the student. It's just really difficult when, there's other people who are not supportive. Okay, like, it's tricky.
So I would say it's a fine line between, what the student wants to be called versus what the student's parent wants them to be called. That's always a hard discussion to have, but as the counselor to kind of work with that student that like, we're human, we're going to make mistakes. Like, what if your teacher accidentally says the nickname when your mom calls in about, missing homeworks or something, so to really help that student to find the support that they need to be able to have that conversation with their parents. But there's, kids can be called whatever name they want to be called. There's,
I guess that was my question. When you said nickname, I wasn't sure what you meant by nickname. And then you said that it seems like there's a policy or something. Is that in light of our transgender youth that they created this policy? That's really interesting to me.
Well, I know it's a policy, but I just think that like legally it can be considered discrimination if you're going to use nicknames for some people and not for others.
Yeah, but to Shannon's point about, the league, I know we had the same issue. I was talking about Charlie, was the idea that when Charlie was dead named and that idea, but also the idea like what's legal, what's not legal. So a legal document versus an illegal document, like why are we getting so hung up on names? And again, it goes back to your culture of your building, which I think you're kind of alluding to. But those really real things about, okay, what's the policy? Is there a policy? And like, is that legal or illegal? But But again, and watching the language in terms of like, I wasn't sure when you said nickname, what that meant. So those types of things like add to, oh, it's just a choice where I feel like this day and versus that day. So if you say nickname versus, and even I've heard a conversation recently, don't ask me what I prefer to be called, right? Don't say preferred,
Yeah.
right? Like that is also the harm. Yeah, this is my name.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, this is my name, these are my pronouns.
Yeah.
It's not, these are my preferred pronouns, it's not, that's who I am, these are my.
And that's what we're trying to get away from, disrupting that idea of choice. So nicknames, the preferred name, are things that allude to choice.
So that's when
Yeah,
you
it's
said
hard.
nicknames, I think of like someone who's named Michael, but you call him Mike,
Right.
like that's,
Yeah.
that's a nickname.
Right.
So-
That's what I was thinking. And I was like, okay, that's not, yeah.
So it's like systematic, trying to get them away from the idea of bird.
Yes.
Questions?
I just have to say thank you.
Yes, thank
for
you.
doing this. And they traveled far, so I'm just so, I mean,
4 hours, and how long did it take you to get? I'm in Hershey, so it didn't take me long, but I was like, I just appreciate them driving up here and that you appreciate it, that I appreciate that. Like, that's awesome. So thank you for acknowledging that. That means a lot.
And that the collaboration we have now between PSCA and.
Yes.
is awesome. And so we're appreciative that PSCA reached out to us.
Yes.
To present. So it's a great collaboration that we need to continue because these counselors and psychologists do work so closely together. And
Yes.
we're doing the same work.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.